Welcome back to Poetry Corner. I've got a slightly different poem for you this morning. This one is called The Hound of Heaven. That's hound as in bloodhound. It's by the Catholic mystic Francis Thompson. And I think it's really an account of his own spiritual experience relating to faith. It's slightly longer. I hope you will still enjoy it. It might not be kids suitable, both for its more complicated language and for its content in one or two places. But for those who want to engage with a slightly more challenging poem from the mystic tradition, I hope this will be interesting. I fled him, down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. And in the mist of tears I hid from him, and under running laughter. Up vistaed hopes I sped, and shot, precipitated, adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears, from those strong feet that followed after. But with unhurrying chase, an unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat, and a voice beat, more instant than the feet. All things betray thee, who betrayest me. I pleaded, outlaw wise, by many a hearted casement, curtained red and trellised with intertwining charities. For, though I knew his love who followed, yet I was sore adread, lest, having him, I must have naught beside. But if one little casement parted wide, the gust of his approach would clash it too. Fear wist not to evade, as love wist to pursue. Across the margent of the world I fled, and troubled the gold gateway of the stars, smiting for shelter on their clanged bars, fretted to dulcet jars and sylvan chatter the pale ports of the moon. I said to dawn, be sudden, to eve, be soon. With thy young skiey blossoms heap me over from this tremendous lover. Float thy vague veil about me, lest he see. I tempted all his servitors to find my own betrayal in their constancy, in faith to him their fickleness to me, their treacherous trueness and their loyal deceit. To all swift things for swiftness did I sue, clung to the whistling mane of every wind. But whether they swept smoothly fleet adown the long savannas of the blue, or whether, tempest-driven, they clashed his flying chariot, fought a heaven plashy with flying lightnings round the spurn of their feet, fear wist not to evade, as love wist to pursue. Still, with unhurrying chase, an unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, came on the following feet, and a voice above their beat. Naught shelters thee, who will not shelter me. I sought no more that after which I strayed, in face of man or maid. But in the little children's eyes seems something that replies they at least are for me, surely for me. I turned me to them very wistfully, but just as their young eyes grew sudden fair with dawning answers there, their angel plucked them from me by the hair. Come then, ye other children, nature's, share with me, quoth I, your delicate fellowship. Let me greet you lip to lip, let me twine with you caresses, wantoning with our Lady Mother's vagrant tresses, banqueting with her in her wind-walled palace underneath her azure dais, quaffing as your taintless way is, from a chalice lucent weeping out of the day-spring. So it was done. I in their delicate fellowship was one. I drew the bolt of nature's secrecies. I knew all the swift importings on the wilful face of skies. I knew how the clouds arise, spumed of the wild sea snortings, all that's born or dies, rosed or drooped with, made them shapers of mine own moods, or wailful or divine, with them joyed or was bereaven. I was heavy with the even when she lit her glimmering tapers round the dead day's sanctities. I laughed in the morning's eyes. I triumphed, and I saddened with all weather. Heaven and I wept together, and her sweet tears were salt with mortal mine. Upon the red throb of her sunset heart I laid my own to beat, and share commingling heat. Yet not by that was eased my human smart. In vain my tears were wet on heaven's grey treak. For we know not what each other says, these things and I. In sounds I speak, their sound is but their stir. They speak in silences. Nature, poor stepdame, cannot slake my drouth. Let her, and she would owe me, and drop yon blue bosom veil of sky, and show me the breasts of her tenderness. Never did any milk of hers once bless my thirsting mouth. Nigh and nigh draws the chase, with unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy. And past those nosed feet a voice comes yet more fleet. Lo, naught contents thee who contents not me. Naked I wait thy love's uplifted stroke. My harness, piece by piece, thou hast hewn from me, and smitten me to my knee. I am defenceless utterly. I slept, methinks, and woke, and slowly gazing, find me stripped in sleep. In the rash lust ahead of my young powers, I shook the pillaring hours, and pulled my life upon me, grimed with smears. I stand amid the dust of the mounded years. My mangled youth lies dead beneath the heap. My days have crackled and gone up in smoke, have puffed and passed like sunspots on the stream. Yea, faileth now even dream the dreamer, and the lute the lutanist. Even the linked fantasies, in whose blossomy twist I swung the earth, a trinket at my wrist, are failing. Chords of all too weak account for earth with heavy griefs so overplussed. Is thy love indeed a weed, albeit an amaranthine weed, suffering no flowers save its own to mount? Must, designer infinite, must thou char the wood ere thou canst limn with it? My freshness spent its wavering shower i' the dust, and now my heart is as a broken fount, wherein tear-drippings stagnate, spilt down ever from the dank thoughts that quiver along the sighful borders of my mind. Such is what is to be. The pulp so bitter, how shall taste the rind? I dimly guess what time in mists confounds. Still ever and anon a trumpet sounds from the hid battlements of eternity. The shaken mists a space unsettle, then round the half-glimpsed turrets slowly wash again. But not ere him who summoneth I first have seen, enwound with gloomy robes purporeal, cypress crowned. His name I know, and what his trumpet saith. Whether man's heart or life it be that yields thee harvest, must thy harvest fields be dunged with rotten death? Now of that long pursuit comes on at hand the brute. That voice is round me like a bursting sea. And is thy earth so marred, shattered in shard on shard? Lo, all things fly thee, for thou fliest me. Strange, piteous, futile thing, wherefore should any set thee love apart, seeing none but I makes much of naught, he said, and human love needs human meriting. How hast thou merited, of all a man's clotted clay, the dingiest clot? Alack, thou knowest not how little worthy of any love thou art. Whom wilt thou find to love ignoble thee, save me, save only me? All which I took from thee, I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou might seek it in my arms. All which thy child's mistake fancies as lost, I have stored for thee at home. Rise, clasp my hand, and come. Halts by me that footfall. Is my gloom, after all, shade of his hand outstretched caressingly? Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest all love from thee when thou dravest me.
Well, I hope that was interesting and not too obscure. Francis Thompson does like to play with language and paint evocative but slightly bewildering word pictures on occasion. You'll be relieved to know I'm not going to go through this whole poem line by line, or we'd be here forever. I just want to pick up a few things about it and a few ways in which I think it can be helpful. The poem is, of course, about the soul's experience of being pursued by God, hence the title, the image of a bloodhound tracking down an animal that's trying to go to ground to find it. And the soul in the poem is fleeing away from God, running away from him because it fears that if it accepts God, it'll lose all the things it delights in. And so it desperately tries to find other things to shield it from God or distract it. And at the end, as he's caught by God's pursuit of him, it becomes clear that everything he was afraid of losing is something that actually God was wanting to give him, that he wasn't going to lose anything that really mattered by receiving God. And in a way, that's the whole big message of the poem, which we'll come back to in a moment. The poem breaks down into a couple of sections, each concluded by this almost repetition of the nigh and nigh draws the chase, but with undisturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy. And each section is wrapped up by the words he hears the voice of God speak, which summarises, in a sense, the lesson he's learned in the preceding section. So the very first section has him trying to hide from God in the confusions and the noise of his own inner life. I fled him down the arches of the years, I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind, and in the mist of tears and under running laughter. And so the rebuke that he gets from God, or the message at the end of that poem, is about how these things will fail him when he tries to take them without God, when he tries to flee God. The second poem, or section of the poem, has him trying to escape God by taking pleasure in, or interest in, other things, and especially the physical creation, the moon, the stars, and so forth, as well as in other people. A hearted casement, curtained red and trellised with intertwining charities, is a lovely picture of a human heart. Intertwining charities is a word for loves for other people. So he tried to flee God by taking refuge with, or distracting, almost trying to find fault with, God's servitors, that is, his servants, his people. But he was foiled by their treacherous trueness and their loyal deceit. That is, they were too faithful to God to be faithful to him. And so again you get the refrain, "Naught shelters thee who will not shelter me." In other words, you're not going to find any safety or security unless you find it with me. Then the poet, the soul, tries to flee to the sort of romantic movement, and either in the innocence and delight of childhood, of children, or in the captivating beauty of the natural world and nature. So he talks about how he immersed himself in the world of nature. I triumphed and I saddened with all weather. How he lost himself in the seas I knew how the clouds arise, spew made of the wild sea snortings. He tried to lose himself in nature, and he found some consolation for a little while. But at the end of the day, nature was not a fit companion for his soul. Ah, we know not what each other says, these things and I. In sounds I speak, their sound is but their stir, they speak in silences. Nature is not the relationship his soul needed. It could not satisfy him. And so the conclusion to that section is naught contents thee, who contents not me. The soul that's fleeing from God is not going to find contentment in any of the things it runs after, in any of the alternatives or replacements to God it pursues, whether that be natural beauty, human beauty, and it's not going to find shelter anywhere else. It's not going to be at rest anywhere unless it has already found rest with God. All this builds up to the final section where the poet imagines himself waking up stripped of his armour, the armour with which he'd been trying to shield himself from the call of God on his heart, stripped of all the things that he'd been holding up like a barricade between him and the relentless approach and call of God. And he describes how he tried to pull his armour back on, but none of it worked. Even his dreams has failed. He can no longer hide in his own fantasies and daydreams. Earth is overcome with griefs. The world looks to him very dark, and none of his other fantasies or refuges seem to work. And in frustration, he shouts at God, "Is your love indeed a weed, albeit an amaranthine weed, an eternal weed, suffering no others save its own to mount?" In other words, do you really have to be so exclusive? Do you have to deny me everything else if I'm going to have you? And I think this is a place the soul can often end up in. That feeling that God is drawing near, that we can't escape the conclusion that he is real and interested in us, but that we don't want to accept him because it'll mean walking away from all the good things of life, from freedom, from dignity, pleasure, relationships, whatever it may be. But as the poet imagines his soul ranting at God like this, "Why do you have to deny me all the good things of life?" he's confronted with another reality, which is the reality of our mortality. And so he imagines himself viewing the shaken mists blow away for a moment from the ramparts of eternity, but not ere him who summoneth I first have seen, enwound with gloomy robes purpureal, cypress crowned. Cypress is a symbol of death. And what's happening there is that he's having a reminder that he'll one day die. And he's confronted with his own mortality. And so he turns to God in frustration, saying, "Whether man's heart or life it be that yield thee harvest, must thy harvest fields be dunged, be fertilised with rotten death?" In other words, is that really the only choice I've got? To face death and annihilation, or to let my life die and to give my whole life over to you and lose all the things that make life worth living, to lose myself? Is that the choice, to have to give up all I am, or face dying and eternal death? And as he is confronted by this dilemma, and he certainly isn't the first to find that confrontation with death leads him to wrestle with matters of faith. As he wrestles with the fact that he will one day die and that he needs to come to terms with that, God catches up with him, and the voice of God overwhelms him and says something that he hasn't been expecting. "And is thy earth so marred, shattered and shard on shard? Lo, all things fly thee, for thou fliest me." And the message that God brings to him is essentially, your life is screwed up not because I'm chasing you, but because you're running away. The reason it feels like you have to abandon everything to go with me is that you've driven everything away in trying to escape me. All which I took from thee I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou mightst seek it in my arms. All that thy child's mistake fancies as lost I have stored for thee at home. Rise, grasp my hand, and come. And I think what Thompson is getting at here is the sense that we run away from God for fear lest he will take away from us all the things that make us who we are and make life worth living. But the truth is, he's the source of all the things that make life worth living. Fun and family and friendship. He's the source of the beauty of nature. He's the source of the joy of human relationships. He's the source of the joy of intellectual discovery, physical strength. He's the source of all that makes us independent, thinking human beings, all that makes us us. Of course, he's not going to take that away from us. Instead, coming to him is where we find the fullness of those things, fullness of life, and the fullness of our potential as a human being. But in our running away from him, in our fleeing him, in our shutting the door on him, we end up losing those things as well. We end up spoiling our relationships, because when we shut the door to God, we try and make our spouse or our children our God, our reason for living. And that's a weight they cannot bear. When we shut the door on God and we try and make the beauty of nature our satisfaction and fulfillment, then it'll disappoint. When we try and make our own inner life our security, it will fall apart. Those things become stable, become savoury, become satisfying when they're in their right place, as satellites orbiting around the love and presence of God. Only there do they fulfill. And so in the final lines of the poem, the footfall, the pursuer, stops by the soul, which is fallen. And he realises that all the shade, all the heaviness and the weight and the sadness and the struggle that has been weighing down his life is, as he puts it, shade of his hand outstretched caressingly. It's the shadow cast by God's hand reaching out in love. And the voice speaks, fondest, blindest, weakest. Fondest there means silliest, most foolish. I am he whom thou seekest. The soul has been running after anything instead of God. It's been desperately running after love in all the wrong places. Been running after fulfillment, dignity, worth, satisfaction in all the wrong places. Actually, what it was seeking was in the one it was fleeing. Thou dravest all love from thee when thou dravest me. But dravest there is drove. So the sense of the poem is that we run away from God for fear lest coming to him, obeying him, living his way, will make us lose all the good things of life, all the good things of ourselves. And yet actually we can only truly find the good things of life. We can only truly find love and happiness and satisfaction. We can only truly find freedom and strength and dignity in God. He's the source of them all. In fleeing him, we flee the very things we think we're trying to find. But the glory of our faith is that God doesn't wait for us to come to him. He chases us down like a bloodhound hunting out the fox that has gone to earth, but not to devour, but to caress, to love, to bless. The Father comes after the prodigal son, and God hunts us down and takes away from us all the things that we've tried to make substitutes for him, so that we will finally have to accept him. And then we'll find the reality that those substitutes could not substitute for. Then we will find the thing we were seeking all along without realising it. Then we will be who we were made to be. We flee what we need. We flee what we want without realising it. But God hunts us down, takes away from us the toys and baubles we have made substitutes for the reality. And that can be a really painful experience. Often God has to strip us bare, take away our pretensions, take away our idols, take away the lesser things we've come to love and worship instead of him, so that he can one day give them back to us to work as they were supposed to, as planets orbiting his star, as jewels in his crown. There's an idea that coming to God is giving up on fun, giving up on freedom, giving up on intellectual rigour. It's none of those things, it's finding them. And until we find them in God, we will always be dissatisfied, because the substitutes that we try and fill that void with will fail. But the real thing, the thing we're desiring without realising it, is in God's hand. And thank goodness that he hunts us down, tracks us down, strips us of the armour we have built up against him, piece by painful piece, so that we have to bow the knee to him and receive what we need. Amen.